Welcome to Book Band's proactively addressing challenges to your comics collection, presented by Library Pass and Comics Plus. My name is Gila Charles Gonzalez. I'm the Chief Content Officer for Library Pass and the moderator for today's session. I'm excited to be joined by a panel of distinguished guests, including Moni Barrette, incoming president for the ALA's Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable, as well as my colleague here at Library Pass, where she's our in-house librarian. Betsy Gomez is the Banned Books Week Coalition Coordinator and Coalition Director for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit organization dedicated to defending the First Amendment rights of the comics community. And Jack Phoenix, Manager of Collection Development and Technical Services for Cuyahoga Falls Library. He's also Brodart's graphic novel selector and the author of Maximizing the Impact of Comics in Your Library, Graphic Novels, Manga, and More. Today's webinar is presented by Library Pass. We curate high-interest, immersive digital content that helps libraries and schools expand their reach and engagement without breaking their materials budget. Our Comics Plus platform offers unlimited simultaneous access to thousands of digital comics, graphic novels, and manga in collections curated for elementary, middle, and high school readers. We also offer a complete collection, including thousands of additional titles for older readers to public and academic libraries. Learn more and sign up for a free demo account at comicsplusapp.com. So I want to welcome our panelists. We are going to talk a little bit about the history of comics challenges, some of the examples of comics that have been challenged over the years. We're going to talk about some proactive and reactive measures that you should be aware of in general. And then we're going to get into some specific conversations around scenarios you may face in the real world in your local library or school. So I'm going to turn this over, I think, to Betsy first to talk us through a brief history of comics challenges.
Well, actually, if it's okay, I'm going to hand it off to Jack to kick us off, and then I'll throw in after Jack does.
Sure. And when we say this is a brief history of comics challenges, we mean brief. So in what we call the golden age of comics in the 1930s and 40s, at one point, like 90% of the country's youth were reading comic books, right? And eventually in the 1950s, you had Dr. Frederick Wortham, who actually stood in front of a congressional committee. He erroneously linked juvenile delinquency with comic books. There's a whole ton of research as to how he did that and why he did that, but it ended up getting the government's notice. And when that happened then, so that was one of the biggest challenges, like national challenges against the medium. They looked at the violence, that there were accusations of homosexuality and bondage and all these other things that they felt were inappropriate for kids. And whether or not they were really there, we could argue all day. But so the comics industry ended up creating the Comics Code Authority, which was a self-governing body. They did that in order to sort of cut off the government before the government could actually pass legislation censoring comics externally. So they decided to do it internally. So that's another example of censorship happening, but it was happening within the publishers themselves. So they would stamp this Comic Code Authority approval, and that was in 1958, I believe, or maybe 54, I forget. But they would stamp this code of approval on a book, and it indicated that there would be no horror, no sexuality, all kinds of things, that everyone had to stay in their gender roles, everything had to have a happy ending, and it was very limiting to the stories they could tell. So the reason that we bring that up is because this rich history of challenges to comics, we see it still happening today. It has effects today. That is why comics are so vulnerable to challenges, even to this day. This is also the reason why it took this medium so long to get into libraries and schools. For a long time, before librarians sort of took this unofficial oath to become stalwart defenders of intellectual freedom, we were the gatekeepers of good reading. And so we would keep comics out of our libraries until very recently, when some of the people that I absolutely adore, and that including Kat Kahn, Robin Brenner, a whole bunch of other people out there, stepped up and said, no, these things belong in our libraries. But that's only been like roughly 20 years that you've seen full-fledged acceptance of comics in libraries. And so they're extremely vulnerable to challenges because they still carry the stigma of being kid stuff and associated with delinquency.
Yeah, just to add to that, the Comics Code, it was actually drafted and approved in 1954, and it was revised a few times over the years. And each revision, it progressively got less restrictive until the point in time where the code itself it didn't really restrict much of anything. But we still feel the repercussions because the only genre that really survived the censorship of the code unscathed was superheroes. And it's part of the reason we have this kind of pervasive misconception that comics are only about superheroes. And also because the restrictions on content, it was really, most of the comics were kind of aimed at like 10-year-old boys when you get right down to it after the code was passed. And so we end up with this pervasive misconception that comics are just for like really young kids. And so a lot of people still hold these firm beliefs that comics aren't valuable literature. And, you know, we still feel those repercussions. I mean, we're only seeing kind of revivals in genres like horror within the last couple of decades. And really, it was the 1989 revision to the code that disempowered it so much that we started seeing kind of a burgeoning, coincidentally, possibly a burgeoning kind of expansion of what comics could do. You know, with that revision in 89, simultaneously, we're seeing the launch of Vertigo at DC. We're seeing this expansion of what comics are capable of. And we're seeing comics that became acceptable to individuals who had traditionally ignored them because they didn't think they're a valid literature expression. You know, stuff like Sandman, stuff like Watchmen, stuff like The Dark Knight Returns. And now we're kind of in this golden age of comics as far as like, you know, we've got something for every age group, for every interest, but we still have these misperceptions left over from the code that we had to deal with. CBLDF was started in 1986 because retailers were running afoul of obscenity laws in various locations. It started with a case in which a retailer in Northern Illinois was arrested for selling underground comics and stuff like heavy metal, which we know today, not obscene. But, you know, retailers don't have a lot of money to defend themselves from obscenity charges. And so CBLDF stepped in to help those retailers. And for a long time, a lot of our work was helping defend retailers from spurious charges. But now most of our work is in schools and libraries because, especially in the last couple of years, what we're seeing has so many parallels to what happened in the early 50s to comics. So many groups organized against the format and hosted burnings and did all of these terrible things in the 50s to restrict this speech. And we're starting to see that pattern again in the last couple of years as far as what reading material our kids are allowed to engage with. And comics in particular are targeted because they have pictures. It's always been the case that you know, comics are censored for the same reasons most books are, but pictures make it easier for people to identify objectionable material.
Real quick, talk a little bit about, so the previous slide had some of the reasons comics get banned. I pulled some of these examples from the CBLDF website, and I purposely picked like bone and drama because part of me is like, what could you possibly find offensive about Bone? Like, it's a fun fantasy cartoon. Are there common denominators when it comes to some of these challenges? And are you seeing anything different in more recent challenges?
Okay, so I can kick this off. That's okay. So with Bone in particular, it's kind of Bone is kind of an outlier in a lot of regards. I think part of the reason it got targeted is because it was so profoundly popular when Scholastic started reprinting it and releasing it in the color formats, and so a lot of kids are reading it, and so a lot of people who probably wouldn't have ever seen it before are starting to see it. And a lot of the initial challenges were over the depiction of smoking and drinking in the book. Even though neither of those are shown in either a positive or a negative light, and neither of those are done by anybody underage. It's the adult characters who engage in those activities. And Bone was also accused of racism in Texas I guess because the the main characters are puffy white people. So it was just a really weird accusation. So Bone is one of those things that's kind of, it's a little bit out there compared to a lot of the challenges that we see. With Dragon Ball, the challenge we started Dragon Ball was over nudity, which for those of you who are familiar with the series, there is some kind of nudity in the book to comedic effect. It's not sexual nudity. It's for comedy purposes. And with drama and genderqueer both, they've been challenged for LGBTQ content, which is probably the most common reason we see the books challenged now is LGBTQ content. Nudity, genderqueer does have some nudity and some sexual content, but it is by no means obscene. And genderqueer has become a real flashpoint among the organizations and the people who are trying to challenge comics right now, in part because we talk about those easily isolated images. It's very easy for people to take an image in genderqueer that they find offensive and they think is obscene, blow that up and show up at a meeting with that. And as for Mouse actually hit the national news earlier this year. For anybody who was under a rock, it was banned in Tennessee over language in the book and nudity as well. And so, I highly recommend reading the school board meetings for that ban in Tennessee. It's entertaining, also very, very saddening. Because what we have is a classic Pulitzer Prize winning graphic novel, one of the graphic novels that really made them relevant and made people pay attention to comics as a format, as a literary format. And you've got a group of people who don't want students to read about this terrible event that happened in our history because they're offended by language and a circle with a dot in it that depicts a bare breast.
And Betsy, can I interject too?
Yeah.
I think it's worth noting that 4 of the 5 on this screen are award winners.
Yes.
And that brings, the sort of double-edged sword of as this medium gains acceptance and gains widespread, it becomes standard in schools and libraries. It's a shame because it also makes them prime targets.
Absolutely. I think all of us can attest, even everyone in chat, that we've all seen things that we assume that the same folks that complain about these would deem as even less appropriate, but because they're not award winners and because they're not in classroom curriculums and on every shelf, they fly under the radar a little bit more.
I would also argue that for a lot of those books, the censorship of those books will fly under the radar too, because they're not as well known. So that's one thing we need to be aware of.
Right.
But before we get into some of the practical side of the session, where we're going to dig into some specific instances that librarians might face, let's talk a little bit about kind of both proactive and reactive measures in general that everyone should be aware of when it comes to thinking about what's in your collection, potential challenges, and how to protect yourself from that.
Sure. So one thing that we did, this is titled Proactive. We are going to discuss in every one of these scenarios how you could potentially have avoided getting into the situation. Stuff is going to happen. It is, but there are lots of ways that you can either avoid it happening at all, or at the very least, have yourself positioned in such a way that you can mitigate it more easily once you are there. And then reactive measures, I'm also going to talk about things you can do during the crisis. I have definitely been through potentially more than my fair share of very tough challenges, community-wide challenges. And then reactive measures, we'll talk about what types of resources are available to you after the fact. Please do report. I know that's an extra layer of bandwidth and capacity that we don't always really want to go to, especially like reliving the whole thing after the fact, but it does help, the proverbial us, the professionals that are out there trying to bring these forms of education to you, help you even more in the future.
Let's jump into some of these specific scenarios. I'm going to flash them up here on the screen, and then I'm going to go back to full screen speaker so you guys can really dig into each one of these. And so what we're talking about here are real world situations that you might face. And what our panelists are going to do is give some background on what are some of the intellectual freedom concerns with each of these situations, and then also talk about specific strategies for how they'd suggest dealing with each one. So the first one is something that happened, I think it was last year's Free Comic Book Day, 2021. During an event at a library, copies of a title meant for mature readers were accidentally handed out to younger readers, along with all ages selections. For each of these scenarios, we've got a link that you guys will be able to click through to get some background on what exactly happened. So let's talk about this scenario a little bit. How would you handle dealing with the repercussions of something like this happening?
So I did read the actual scenario, like the article about it, which is included here on our slides, but I didn't see if this, it looked like it was addressed after the fact, like that the patron who received the book came back afterwards and complained, because, you know, I do have a little bit of input on, like, if it were to have happened, you know, if someone's flipping through it in the library that day and they come up to you, that's something that might take a staff member that's running, you know, the event aback a little bit. So something that I'm going to be harping on for the duration of our webinar today is good communication. And I don't want to say drilling, that's really harsh, but really working with staff on talking points, best practices, and, you know, and we're talking staff at all levels, who they can go to, like what supervisor that day, what supervisor in general to send people to, and what to say and how to deal with. And really this goes for any day, conflicts, how to deal with patron complaints at the time of, how to follow up, all of that type of thing. So in this situation, it looks like the complaint came back afterward, but had it happened then, you know, a profuse staff apology and an assurance that this was a one-off that was missed, and that a follow-up from a supervisor will be forthcoming, is a great way to handle it on face. Also removal of the materials right away. And then after the fact, debriefing with staff, you know, even if it's a brief email bulleting, like, here's what happened last Saturday at Free Comic Book Day, here's how staff on scene handled it, here's what we did about it, here's what you can do going forward. I know that Jack is going to chime in with a lot of like great resources and things, so I will not cover that part right now, but that's a starting point, is working with staff on something like this.
Yeah, and as far as intellectual freedom concerns with this issue, I don't really see too many, you know, maybe someone will disagree, but, you know, this was an item that was not intended for children, period. This isn't the situation where something is intended for kids and someone objects to the content and they say, well, no, this isn't okay for any kid. This was not for kids. So, you know, it's really just like correcting an error that never should have happened to begin with. And definitely when it comes to Free Comic Book Day and any prizes that you give out at your library of any kind, you should always be reviewing them as best to your ability, but mistakes will happen.
Yeah, I just want to provide a little bit more background. So this did happen at a library last year, and it was with a book called Fun Girl Tales of the Grown Up Nothing by Elizabeth Pitch. Pitch has a very kind of juvenile art style, so it looks like it's a kid-friendly comic. And last year we had kind of a perfect storm of well, things that kind of contributed to this situation, because Diamond had changed their labeling for the Free Comic Book Day books to use color-coded labels for the different age categories, but they hadn't communicated that very well, or the communications just hadn't made it to the appropriate parties. And so a lot of people weren't aware that the labels are different now for depending on the age group: red for mature readers, green for all ages, and I think blue for kind of the middle grades and teens. And so it wasn't communicated very well for various reasons. And so people weren't aware of that labeling system. Also, I believe in this case, while the parent did complain after the fact, they complained early enough that the books were pulled from the selections that were remaining in the program. What's unfortunate in this case, though, is that because of this, the library has elected to never participate in Free Comic Book Day again. And so that's an intellectual freedom concern, because, you know, this is something that was good for the community, builds community, and they've decided not to participate again because of this. And I can't say I blame them, but it does concern us on an intellectual freedom issue level. We've also seen similar incidences happen with comic book retailers. Several years ago, CBLDF actually defended a retailer who had handed out a mature reader's title. This is prior to Diamond having the different labels for Free Comic Book Day titles. But at the point in time, there was always a label in the back of the book if it was for mature readers. it was accidentally distributed to some kids, and the parents went straight to the authorities and wanted the retailer arrested for distributing obscene material. The material was obscene by objective, subjective, and legal. It was not obscene by objective, subjective, legal standards. It was wasn't something that the retailer should have been arrested for. But you know, when that happens, you still have to go through court, and it costs a lot of money, and CBLDF helped defend the retailer. We had a similar situation happen with Fun Girl, actually, in another retailer. I can't provide a lot of details, but that retailer does kind of mixed merchandise. And so it's not just comics, but they decided to stop selling comics because they were so worried over the response to Fun Girl in their community. And then this year, we didn't get any reports of complaints, but we did hear rumors that there were going to be organized protests against Shannon Waters' new book, Hollow, because it features a gay character, a lesbian character. And so it's something to be aware of. What I would recommend, if you participate in Free Comic Book Days, talk to your local retailers. They can be your partners in this and help you understand the content if you're not familiar with it. And I would also recommend paying attention to kind of local community groups on Facebook, because if there is going to be an organized protest, it usually happens, it's usually discussed there, and it can help you kind of prepare for any potential protest that comes up.
One thing that I'm hoping that folks will take away from this whole webinar too is, obviously there's always going to be forces outside of your control or above your pay grade, but to try to become educated enough that hopefully in the future you wouldn't have to stop selling comics or not have a free comic book day anymore. You know, if you're armed with enough information and skills to kind of navigate any of these scenarios, maybe we don't have to lead with as much fear anymore going forward.
So that's a good segue. That first scenario was almost like a trick one, because in some ways it was an accident, but it kind of illustrates how precarious, particularly these days, an innocuous accident can have ripple effects all the way to not participating in Free Comic Book Day, stop selling comics, et cetera, et cetera. So now let's, these next scenarios get into a little deeper, and Betsy kind of alluded to this one. So let's talk a little bit about organized campaigns. How do you handle when there's actually, it's not a parent saw something that, oh, hey, I don't think this is great, blah, blah, blah. So in this scenario, we're talking about a local political group uses Facebook and email to organize their campaign, going after allegedly inappropriate books in the children's section of the library. In this example, they took pictures of comics that they claimed were objectionable and alleged that they were in the children's library, even though they actually weren't. And we all know how, you know, messages travel on Facebook and email. They actually called on people to go to the library, look for the offending books, and to pack a public library meeting in protest. Again, link here. So let's talk a little bit about this. I call these kind of bad faith challenges. Nothing bad actually happened, but there's an actual organized campaign that implies it did, and now you have to deal with it. So what are some of your suggestions for, first, let's talk about the intellectual freedom aspect, and then how do you actually address a situation like this?
Shall I go? So I would say, as far as intellectual freedom, so I think that Betsy would agree with me on this, that when it comes to the Facebook campaigns, there ain't a whole lot you can do about it, because that is public forum and that's free speech. So hopefully your library has a very strong PR policy. Hopefully you have a very strong PR employee who can handle that element of it. And maybe that element is just absolutely not engaging at all, right? But hopefully your policy with that is strong, and probably non-engagement is the best idea. And I would say that that's probably a good idea too when the people come into the library. And that's also where having a strong policy is going to be important, because I would say the intellectual freedom issue there is that it is a public library. I'm assuming. I mean, some of you are school librarians, but it's a public library. If it's a public library, then they have the right to be in your building. And as long as they are following, they have the right to be in your building and look for as much objectionable material as they want, as long as they are following the behavior policies that you have in place and your circulation policies, that they're not defacing or destroying your property. That's a whole nother scenario. So if they are kind of coming into the building to look for these objectionable materials, non-engagement. Okay, do you need help finding it? You know, it's because they probably want you to get angry and want you to get stirred up, want you to get mad. But if you're just, if you recognize that as long as they're adhering to your behavior policies and every other policy that you have, then there's not a whole lot you can do about it. And I would say just make sure that those are strong and review them after this webinar if you have any doubts.
So when we're talking about these Facebook groups, one thing is, I have to say, if they're going to be, it's an element of another thing that you have to monitor, which is no fun. We have plenty to do in our jobs. That being said, because they're going to bring these problems to your doorstep, hey, thanks for the heads up that it's out there publicly and that you can see it as well. So, do your best to monitor these, assign different staff maybe to monitor different elements so that everybody can bring in a piece of the puzzle. Proactively have the consideration for reconsideration materials, the request form. Ask them if they have what their library card number is, and then make sure you check it when you go through such a comment form, because also remember that if these are folks that are just in a general Facebook group, they may not actually be part of the group they're saying they are, the local area. They may definitely not be a library patron, in which case, obviously, they're welcome to come in and look through the collection as they have threatened to do. But you are not responsible for their tastes. You are responsible for the public and the community in which you are there to serve. So automatically, that's a little bit like, red flag. This person doesn't even belong to this library, wouldn't be accessing these materials anyway. And then, as Jack said, just be accommodating / really work with staff beforehand. Practicing even before you see these types of things come up is just non-engagement. Maybe if you have a PR person, if you're a large enough library that's lucky enough to have that, get that person right away or notify them to come meet and greet. Other than that, know that they may film you. So figure out in advance what your policy and how you're going to handle that. Make sure that they're adhering to the library's code of conduct. If you feel at all threatened, or if it's probably just a good idea to let obviously library admin, and then, encourage them to let, city or whoever is your administrative body know about the situation, just so that nobody is blindsided by it. Because these always have these ripple effects. Potentially, if you have security or you'd like to just let police know for your safety, because things can definitely escalate. Things can definitely be filmed and made to look different than they are. At the end of the day, it's a public place. They can come in and look. Hopefully, make sure you have your ducks in a row, but again, they gave you the heads up. Hopefully they can attest that, things are actually in the correct area. If it is some kind of difficult content, it's in the older teen or adult section, and there shouldn't be a reasonable issue there.
Great advice from Jack and Moni. I just want to throw in that, so this situation, as you may observe from the link, happened in Bloomington, Illinois. And we actually reached out to a librarian there, and they have strong review policies and collection development policies, and they're like, we're not worried, we got this, which is great to hear. And this is something that you get that boost from having good policies. Definitely endorse having a media policy and designating a spokesperson, such that, if you're not comfortable talking to the public, find somebody who is. And when you isolate your spokesperson or most of your communication to one or two individuals, you ensure that a consistent message is presented every time. And I know, acknowledging it can be difficult. Don't hesitate to reach out to your fellow librarians and to groups like CBLDF for advice. We're always there to help and provide advice. A lot of times, a lot of the work we're doing almost feels like counseling, is just helping people understand their rights and letting them vent and talk about kind of their concerns with what's happening. So just don't hesitate to reach out when you need help.
And briefly, the one portion of that we didn't really hit was kind of modding a meeting, but really it's the same answer. As long as they're adhering to the code of conduct that your board has approved for how meetings are legally supposed to go, then hey, there's nothing you can do about it. Well, you're welcome. You're welcome to come here as long as you adhere to these guidelines. If they don't, that's a different story. And that's where Moni suggested maybe giving the authorities the heads up that you might need them, or security.
So Jack kind of segued to the next scenario here. Sometimes these organized campaigns are all smoke, no fire. They're not members of the library. They're templated emails, and they're just trying to kind of cause a fuss. Sometimes they turn into real world actions, whether it's a school board meeting, a library board meeting, they actually show up. And they show up either with misleading information similar to the photos, or information out of context. I know this has happened a lot with one page from Genderqueer. That's the proof of porn in the library. So what is some of your advice for actually, you're at this meeting, this happens, how do you recommend responding to that? And what, again, with all of these, the intellectual freedom concerns that might come with it?
So I have a couple of real life examples where I have survived really big issues that led to these kind of board meetings. Once was when the library that I was at was being outsourced, and that was a very unpopular opinion by the community, and staff kind of got caught in the middle of that. And once another time, again, not comics related, but the library that I was at was holding a drag queen story time, and that actually got national media. We had an actual registered like hate group come after us about that. They attended every one of the city council meetings, every one of the library board meetings. Many disgusting, filthy things came out of what they're saying, and hours of my life that I won't get back. So I can definitely give you some good advice. Number one, again, give a heads up. I don't care what level of staff you're at, give a heads up to your supervisor, encourage them to do the same with theirs. City council, the library board, the school board, whoever you work for, your governing body, the more heads up that they know, and the more that you've kept in touch with them about everything else library related all the way through, the more, at the very minimum, they're not going to be blindsided, and the more that you are going to have some idea of where they're going to land on this. Because we all know you could get an incredibly supportive admin / governing body, great, or you will already have a heads up that, you know, a scenario like we're going to talk about in a minute where, you know, somebody's job is going to get lost or that kind of thing could occur. You will have kind of a heads up and a sense of that and know how to respond accordingly. And then that being said, just make sure that you have your code of conduct ready. You have given talking points again to the folks, the stakeholders that you're discussing things with. The staff know the talking points, and honestly, talk as little as possible beyond the pre-agreed upon talking points, because the more you say, the more there's room to argue. And there's just some things that you're never going to convince people of. Make sure also that you're following the rules of a board meeting, which is they have to fill out a request to comment in advance. They are timed on how long they're able to comment. And should they become completely unruly based on your code of conduct, you have folks ready and available to ask them to simmer down or escort them out. And then just do your best to kind of weather it and rely on other staff and hopefully your admin to kind of vent to and go through the things in the background, because during that time, you're going to have to kind of sit through some rocky things. I'll tell you what.
So all great points, Moni. That's awesome. Amazing points. So this is happening, as we mentioned, a lot with Mayako Babes Genderqueer, but we've also seen kind of similar attacks on other comics in particular, because pictures are very easy to isolate. A lot of the intent of this kind of disruption of the meetings is specifically that disruption. It's to intimidate school boards into removing this material without considering it per their policy. And in several situations, it doesn't matter. It hasn't mattered how strong the policy at the school was. The school board has capitulated to these demands, because when you have a large group of people and they're yelling and screaming at you that you should be arrested for giving kids obscene material, you know, it's a little scary. And that's why, you know, just echoing Moni's points about having policies and speaker policies and ensuring that disruption is dealt with appropriately. it's a very important thing to have. And just noting also, one of the complaints that a lot of these people organizing these efforts like to make when they are removed from a room is that they're being censored. But the fact is if they're disrupting the meeting and keeping work from being done, you have a right to remove them from the meeting, and it's not censorship. It's something that is, ensuring that everybody has time to speak, and ensuring that not only one voice is heard. And so it's something to be aware of, is you might get complaints about censoring speakers if you have to remove them, but if they're breaking your rules, you can remove them. Another thing that you can do as a librarian and educator in these districts is to leverage the people who support these materials and have them come to the meetings as well. A lot of the meetings that we've seen where censorship has been overturned or it hasn't happened has involved a large number of people from the community who came to support the material. Students in particular. Now, I'm not saying you need to radicalize your students because you can get in trouble for that. But, if students are coming to you to ask questions about what their rights are, have resources ready for them so that they know what their rights are as far as these meetings are concerned, so that they know that they can do this and not that. That's one thing you can do if the students are coming to you. And just to understand that, the community supports the material and making sure those voices are there as well.
And Betsy, you completely took the wind out of my sails, because that's what I was going to say, to make sure that you get out, you find allies in the community who do support it, and convince them to be as loud, whether it's on social media or at the board meeting, school board meeting, whatever you need to do, that you galvanize the troops and have an army of your own that's on your side, not even your side, but just the side of intellectual freedom and the side of the library or the school that will support you. So that's exactly what I was going to say.
And that's another benefit, again, of keeping your stakeholders and your admin in the loop too, is if you're not in a position to directly ask somebody, hey, can you advocate for us? They will know somebody who hears about it, who will go to the media or everyone else. And you can't, you can't control what other folks are going to do on your behalf. So.
All right. Yeah. One side note on that local advocacy part, on the industry side of things, that's something we talk a lot to authors about. It's like, hey, authors, it's great to talk at a national level that you're against book bans. What are you doing to support your local library, your local school board? Make sure your voice is heard at that local level, because that's going to have a lot more impact than just signing on to being a signature on some multi-name national effort. While those are good too, acting locally is really important. So let's jump into this next scenario. Genderqueer keeps coming up. It's the kind of hot button comic du jour. Again, we're focusing on politicians getting involved. This is a slightly different scenario. This is politicians sending out letters to school superintendents saying that they will not partner with vendors who make child pornography accessible. It's a very loosely phrased proposition, because the assumption there is that genderqueer is child porn, and so therefore any vendor becomes troublesome. It simultaneously attempts to put pressure on vendors to not carry these books. So something I always talk about a lot is that legislation doesn't have to ever pass to have an impact. This is one of those examples where just the threat of losing business or the threat of losing your job can often be all that's required for that soft censorship. So when something like this happens, whether you're in a school library or a public library where a proposition has been put out by local politicians to not work with vendors who make this challenged content accessible, I think some big intellectual freedom concerns there. Also, how do you recommend dealing with that as someone who's probably not the director in charge of making the final decisions here?
So I'll jump on this if y'all don't mind. I mean, this is a horrifying scenario, and it's kind of one of those worst nightmare kind of situations. And let's say someone in my position, manager of collection development, there's not a whole lot that I can do grand, right? I mean, I can't individually take this to court. And as you just pointed out, it may not necessarily, even if my institution takes it to court, the damages could be done. And is anyone going to really follow through with that? I mean, it's really scary. So I think the only thing that someone in my position could do, and someone probably in the similar positions in our audience, would be to once again look at your collection development policy and make sure that it is strong, that you have a strong reason that you selected that item. Because every item that you select in your library you should have a strong reason. Make sure that you have data, info, as much as you can gather that backs up the fact that yes, this is age appropriate. Here are the expert testimonies as to why it's expert appropriate. Here's, experts in education, experts in literacy. Here are the reviews. Here are similar books about similar topics that are age appropriate that no one's complaining about. And just make sure that you've got your ducks in a row with that, so that you can at least, if it gets to legislation, I don't know what you can do about it other than, reaching out and asking for help. And I'm sure that Betsy would have much more to say in regards to the big picture, but at least you can say, this is why we have this item. This is why I got it. I did not get this mindlessly. I did not choose this mindlessly. And this is why it belongs here. And this is why it belongs on that shelf. And just be ready to be able to defend that.
So the concern with this particular type of policy, this political pressure that we're seeing in a lot of locations, but particularly in Texas, and this scenario is a reference to a letter that Jared Patterson put together. He's a representative in the Texas State Assembly, and he sent it to all of the school districts asking that they sign this letter saying that they would not buy books from vendors who sell obscene material. It doesn't define what obscene material is, but it does specifically mention books like genderqueer. And so what we have here is, a lot of times it's not really an interest in protecting students. It's a political act. They're trying to score political points. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. But what's concerning in this particular case is that there are school districts in Texas that have either adhered to this letter or have started removing books from another representative, Cruz, the 850 book list. There are school districts in Texas that have started removing books that are on that list. And so while neither of these things are legally binding in any way whatsoever, they raise intellectual freedom concerns because some schools will follow through on these actions. And so you need to be aware of that. And if you see it happening in your community, you absolutely need to reach out to organizations like CBLDF, ALA, National Coalition Against Censorship, because these actions are unconstitutional and it might require legal action from local individuals and from these organizations in order to get a school system to stop doing this. And that's the thing about unconstitutionality is we have lots of unconstitutional laws and actions on the books, but until they're challenged in court, you can't stop them. And court costs money. And that's why CBLDF, ALA, and all these other organizations exist. We're here to help fight those.
And if you're a director or admin, a public library admin on this webinar, I also advise you to kind of give your board a crash course in ethics so that any school board or any library board would know not to sign something like this, that they would recognize this is unethical for us to sign this. We can't.
I do want to add from a vendor perspective now too, that it is okay to gain additional backing from the vendor wherever you are, buying these books from. They may not have that readily available because they don't work the same way as a public library, but that helps them get a feel for what it is their customers actually need. And because you are the paying customer, you do have a right to at least reach out and see why did you purchase this material for us to be able to to then use. Do you have any kind of age curation or policies, involving this? And if not, but that could be an extra layer that, again, you're entitled to as the paying customer. And the more that you do that, I'll say again, from the vendor perspective, the more it does raise the bar for vendors working with libraries. And then the more that we can start demanding from publishers and from other folks that provide data for these things, so that everyone is kind of covered in, no, this was an adult level. We said that on the face, the library put it in the right place, and you're wrong, period. Or, oops, this one slipped through. Here's how that could have happened and how we'll avoid that again. Stuff happens. But anyway, that's another layer that I'd like to kind of, again, to add to your docket of all the things to do in these situations, but it is valid.
All right, so the previous scenario, kind of a mostly out of your individual control. Now let's take it to the one that potentially a lot of you may find yourself facing. Some sort of external action leads to the demand to remove a book, a series of books. You, as the librarian tasked with doing this, what do? So in this scenario, the head librarian refused, pointed out that it's censorship, pointed out their collection development policy, et cetera, and she was subsequently fired. I think Betsy's got some additional background on this specific scenario. Let's talk about what I think is probably the most pressing reality for a lot of librarians. How do you deal with this kind of large situation that ultimately could cost you your job?
I can kick it off with a little more background. This is actually happening in Llano, Texas. There's been a number of issues with Llano in that the library board was replaced by election with individuals who are inclined to remove books from the library. And it's been an ongoing issue. Last fall, they tried to shut down the library for several days in order to basically look for the 850 books on Cruz's list and remove those. There was outcry, so they declined to follow through on that act, but it's been kind of it's a snowball effect of incidents in Llano. And Suzette Baker was the librarian there, and she refused to remove several books that the library director had told her to do so. She was subsequently fired for creating a disturbance, insubordination, violation of policies, and failure to follow instructions. As a result of that, I don't think Baker has taken legal action yet, but she is considering it. But several patrons in the district, and this is key because in order to file a lawsuit, you have to have somebody local to be listed as a plaintiff, have filed a lawsuit against the library alleging violation of their First Amendment rights and demanding that the books be restored to the library. It is a very clear First Amendment case in this situation because their rights are being violated.
Also, another benefit of being in contact with your administrators, with the stakeholders, is you'll have a sense of where the wind is blowing, right? And that's when you should start getting these things in writing. Have these conversations, and if they're not going great, start following up in writing so that you have a trail, so that, heaven forbid, this type of thing happens, you do have something to kind of fall back on.
Yeah, like you described it, it's a nightmare scenario. And this is hardly my own original thought, because on one hand, I am just, yeah, you go. Like, yes, I'm so glad you did it. You're sticking up ethics. Yeah, you lost your job for it. It's a sacrifice. But on the other hand, have we lost a good librarian who could have fought another day? And that is something that's really difficult to reckon with in this scenario, because I hate to ever advocate for censorship. But on the other hand, maybe there was was this a battle that got lost at the expense of the war? I don't know how to phrase it, but I just hate the thought that we could lose really good people over these situations. And so on one hand, I feel like this librarian is 100% in the right, and I advocate, and I would stand by this person, and I'm really glad that others are stepping up to defend, not this person, maybe not necessarily her position individually, but at least what she was standing for. But really give it some thought. And like you just said, Moni, if you see the wind blowing in this direction, if you see the writing on the wall, maybe start thinking. Maybe reach out and get legal representation if you can. Reach out to Comic Book Legal Defense Fund or ALA and see what your options would be if the worst case scenario were to happen. I'm not sure if this person did that, but because maybe this was an informed decision this person made, or maybe there could have been some help that this person could have reached out to and avoided some of this. Not that I'm not in any way suggesting this is this person's fault at all, but just saying that if they had reached out for help at a national level before the firing, maybe something could have been done, or really good advice could have been given.
Yeah, I'm going to say that in most situations like this, reaching out before it happened probably would have helped. But I think this is a special case. So while this is terrifying, I don't think this is something that is typical. But it is a really good example of kind of what librarians are facing in some areas right now. And so there is a larger degree of caution for to be taken as a result of these types of actions. And yeah, definitely, if you have questions, reach out to CBLDF. We're happy to answer questions and talk people through things. In Suzette's case, I think even if she had reached out, it probably wouldn't have been able to stop this situation, because the board itself is not upholding the principles of intellectual freedom.
All right, so let's, we've got a few minutes left. We've got a few questions I want to cover. These slides we will make available online along with the recording. We'll have the recording up in about a week or so. These are links on this resource slide. They are not by any means comprehensive. They are a good, solid overview. Some of you have identified these already in the chat, which is awesome. It's like, hey, all right, we picked some good ones. A couple, so you're familiar with what a few of these are. Every library's legislation of concern, they are tracking all of the proposed legislation and past legislation that's out there related to book bans, not specifically comics. It's both fascinating and depressing to go through, but it's also a really educational process if you're either in the midst of this already or worried that this might be coming to your community. Several of you called out Kelly Jensen's excellent coverage at Book Riot. Absolutely encourage you all to follow and keep track. She is doing exhaustive work in tracking these censorship challenges across the country, but also doing really intelligent work around digging deeper. In 90% of these cases, it's not actually about the books. The books are the Trojan horse. It's political action. It's drumming up support for midterm elections. It's political campaigns that are using books as kind of the Trojan horse. We do have a sample collection development policy from Cuyahoga Falls that you can look at. We've got ALA's sample reconsideration form, and I see Martha Hickson in the chat suggested that that's not enough. There's a link she shared. I haven't had a chance to review that, but I know several of you have recommended it. We'll take a look at that as well. CBLDF, Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, that Betsy's representing, an amazing resource. They have a lot of excellent information up on their website. We highlighted this one in particular, the student rights fact sheet. I think it was Betsy, it was like, be careful, you don't want to be accused of radicalizing students, but you absolutely can inform them of what their rights are. And then Graphic Novel Comics Roundtable has an ongoing survey about addressing these challenges that we'd encourage you to participate in. And the expectation is there's going to be some great resources that come out of those findings. So we've got 3 quick questions we're going to dive into. And I think we're going to have covered everything. Everybody's Twitter handles are here, and then I'm going to drop this slide so you can talk. So first is, what do you do if your district refuses to create or has but refuses to use a formal plan for dealing with challenges like this?
I'm going to jump on this one. So if they refuse, and therefore this is like a board decision too, so I would keep going higher if I were in that situation. So if it's the director refusing, if it's the collection development manager refusing, I'd go to the director. If it's the director refusing, I would go to the board. You'll ruffle some feathers for sure, but it's absolutely the right thing to do. And then if the board is ignoring you, I would then reach out to one of the national organizations that we have listed that can help. And then maybe it's a matter of even reaching out to the community and saying, hey, this is your library. And this collection development policy is also to protect you and your tax dollars and your intellectual freedom, and put the onus of responsibility and recognize that this isn't just an issue for library staff. This is an issue for you and the content that we carry. And, so any collection development policy should have certain things that you should definitely be looking for. And you should look at your own when you get off this webinar and make sure they're there. So you want to definitely look for which is new. I didn't realize this. I never thought about it, but a cooling down period. So that was a new concept to me that I just learned. So if something is challenged, have it in your policy and then your collection development or request for reconsideration policy that this item cannot be challenged again for this long, or this item cannot be challenged again for the exact same issue. Because then you don't, that can prevent someone from just coming in and just, challenging it over and over again. Make sure that it has a policy in there that says that as the item is going through the formal challenge process, that it will not be removed from circulation. It will remain in circulation while it's being challenged. Those are just some things to look for. And also, you definitely want to just make sure that your entire staff knows where all these front-facing staff, admins, everybody, make sure they know where your collection development policies are and where your request for reconsideration policies are.
And just add, I think there are a couple of reasons that people might be resistant to implementing these policies. One, they might think they don't need it. So gathering examples of how not having a policy can work against them is a good strategy. Explaining to them, hey, if we don't have this policy, this is how it can affect your life. And the other thing is the work involved. It takes some work to write a policy. So just write the policy yourself and present it to them and say, hey, look, this is the policy I wrote. These are the sources I use. These are the reasons we should do this. I did all your work. All you got to do is approve it.
Yeah, sometimes it's not sinister. Sometimes it's laziness. So if you do the bulk of the work, that could be half the battle.
I have nothing to add. You guys nailed it. It's totally true.
All right, we've got two more I want to try and get us through. So this is a common problem with comics. What are the best resources to evaluate comics and manga's age appropriateness, since there aren't that many professional reviews? And in a lot of cases, the librarians involved are not necessarily comics fans themselves.
My perspective now, I go back to the publishers. And I know that seems like that's a vendor answer, but honestly, you're welcome to do that as well. And I think you'd be pleasantly surprised at how forthcoming most of the publishers are, because they want to work with libraries and schools. They want the dollars from working with libraries and schools. And so a lot of them actually have designated folks who will work with you on that. And they can even give you some insight. No, we hired a teacher to put this in the appropriate level. Or actually, we're struggling with that. What is your recommendation? It becomes a dialogue that then leads to a more communal situation. So don't be afraid to reach out. And if you don't know anyone directly there and you're not seeing it on their website, reach out to one of us, because we probably know someone.
Yeah, and along with books that have been written by librarians and teachers that deal with this topic, in the same vein of turning to the publishers, turning to the vendors. So like at Brodart, I actually do go through and kind of hand pluck out titles that we put into our what we call kid safe. So we've got kid safe, LGBT kid safe, and those are just titles that sort of have like my seal of approval as a professional that yes, this is in age appropriate area. And my trick is I use the previews publication, which is provided by Diamond. You can reach out to any local comic store or probably Diamond themselves and get this publication. It's huge and it comes out every month, and you can get that for either very cheap or free. And it can also come digitally, and that goes through all of the upcoming manga, graphic novels, comics. It goes through everything coming up from every major publisher and then some, and it will usually list the age appropriateness as far or what the publisher says is the age appropriateness for that title. And then you can always, of course, review it yourself. NetGalley, it's awesome.
Yeah, just reiterating that go to the publishers, see what their age ratings are. But I would also talk to your local comics retailers because they can be your best partner in identifying the audience for these books. And there are a few third-party kind of review sites like Goodreads that you can look at, but always take that with a grain of salt because sometimes those ratings can be skewed. The thing I like about Goodreads is like the kids' reviews. Like when I'm looking at a book, I look at the kids' reviews to see what the kids think about the content, because they tend to have a different point of view than adults do. And so that's one thing to consider. But I think, you want to look at all of these sources. Don't look at any one source as being particularly accurate, because it's a process. We're still developing these kind of standards for content and understanding the age ratings in comics, because we don't have an objective system for accommodating for images and text. With prose, we can talk about Lexile scores, which isn't a perfect system, but it's not the worst system. But you can't do that with comics. And so I would go to multiple sources and see what the consensus is.
No Flying, No Tights is also another good one. It's got its limitation because it does not, by the title, it doesn't really do superhero stuff, but it's really good for everything else.
All right, we've got time. We're over time, but we're going to squeeze this one last question because we got several variations on shelving. So whether it's comics that seem to be kid friendly, but the content is at a higher level, or just drawing that line between teen versus YA or YA versus adult. What are some recommendations you have for properly shelving once you've determined where you think a title falls? What are your recommendations for shelving, whether it's to ensure younger readers don't inadvertently get access to older materials, or in some cases, there's concerns about vice versa. You don't want to clog up what the older readers might be interested in with more juvenile work. So what are some recommendations you have there?
Well, it's always best to err on the side of older. So if there's content that you are worried that is probably leading more towards an older audience, shelve it with the older, shelve it with YA. If it's one of those titles that you're questioning, because it's better to be able to allow a younger reader to just go to that shelf and find the item, or you go find the item for the younger reader and here you go, rather than have that item be found explicitly in the younger shelves intended for a younger audience, and then oops, I was wrong, I made a bad decision, this was not intended for kids, my bad. At least then you have some justification, because if it's a public library, there should be no shelves that are off limits by age. So your younger patrons should still be allowed to browse the adult shelves or the YA shelves.
Yeah, I agree. I would say you got to keep them separated. Definitely, even if you have a tiny library, you have one shelf for all of it, then use your signage and your cataloging to make sure that you have a separate teen, you have a separate kids, you have a separate adult at very minimum. And also, yes, age up. If you think a series is starting already on a border, age it up, because often it will age up along with the readers, actually, theoretically. And I had another one that just escaped me, but if it is more juvenile reading level, but with content that's of interest to a little bit older teens or adults, it does need to be in the older age, where the actual subject matter will be of interest to that age. Generally speaking, the characters' ages will kind of denote who the reader is meant to be, and it's not our business whether someone's at a lower reading level, English as a second language, or maybe they just want a brain break and they were interested in the topic. That shouldn't be a factor. The right book will find the right reader and vice versa, as long as you make it available in the right area.
All right, so that we are a bit over time. I want to thank everybody for attending who joined us live. We will make this recording available. You'll be able to find it at librarypass.com or at our YouTube channel. You can look for Library Pass. Want to thank Betsy, Moni, and Jack for taking the time and sharing their expertise. This is a topic we could have probably gone 2 more hours on, particularly that last scenario of when your job is potentially at stake. I think at the end of the day, for a lot of people, that becomes a personal sticking point about where you draw the line. But I think this is a timely topic because we're seeing these challenges increasing. We're seeing pressure not just being put on libraries, but on vendors as well. We're seeing some states being hyper aggressive about how they're going about this. So, educate yourself about what's going on, take advantage of all the sources out there, check in on CBLDF, ALA's, what is it, Office of Intellectual Freedom, checking with the roundtable. We're going to do a follow-up on this probably in the fall because my guess is this will remain a timely topic, unfortunately. Jack?
Can I take 1 second to throw something out? So we had a link about the survey for the ALA committee for challenging comics. I just want to say that by ALA annual, we hope to have an effective toolkit that will be a new resource that we can all turn to. I meant to say that earlier. I apologize. So keep your eye on ALA conference and look for that news to come out. We will have that posted, obviously, unless something comes up. But yeah, that will hopefully be another resource everyone can turn to that will be extremely valuable.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your afternoon. We will see you online and in the library. Take care.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everyone.